My name is Harvey Danvers, and at the age of 82, I sometimes wake up with the vague sensation that my life is no longer entirely my own, that it has been parceled out into little regulated units of time and care decided by others who speak about me as if I am an object and not the same man who once worked 40 years in a steel plant, raised a family in a modest but respectable neighborhood, paid every tax and mortgage note on time, and buried a wife who had been the truest companion anyone could ask for. The mornings in this nursing home are all the same, a bell ringing somewhere in the corridor, the shuffling of aides in white sneakers, the smell of instant coffee drifting from a machine that dispenses something hot but never what I would have once called real coffee, and the sound of a television always tuned to some morning talk show with hosts who seem young enough to be my grandchildren. I sit in my bed and wait until someone remembers to bring the tray, and then I eat quietly, staring at a window that shows a patch of Ohio sky that looks more or less the same every day. When Margaret, my wife, was alive, mornings were an entirely different thing, a ritual of shared glances and small conversations that carried more tenderness than any grand declarations ever could. And even though she has been gone for 13 years, I can still feel her presence when I stir my coffee or when I button the second button of my shirt, because she always teased me that I left that one crooked. After her death, life shrank around me faster than I had anticipated. And what surprised me most was not loneliness, but the way other people began to treat me as fragile, as if grief had broken something in my spine. My son Michael came around more frequently in those first months, urging me to move into assisted living, to downsize, to let him handle the complicated paperwork that accumulated in the house. I refused at first, clinging to the four walls that contained the memory of our shared life, but eventually my knees and my blood pressure convinced me that perhaps he was right. And 2 years ago, I signed the admission papers for this place, telling myself it would only be temporary, a stopover where I could get my strength back. The truth is that once you cross the threshold of a care facility, the world outside begins to recede like a shoreline seen from a departing ship, and before you know it, you are reduced to charts and scheduled visits. I have always feared dependence, and yet here I am, grateful when a stranger remembers to wheel me to the dining hall, humbled when I need assistance with medications that once I sorted for Margaret with steady hands. I tell myself that humility is not the worst lesson to learn at this stage, but sometimes it tastes bitter. What gnaws at me more deeply than frailty itself is the suspicion that my son does not see me any more as the man who raised him, but rather as a bundle of liabilities, a body tied to financial documents, an obstacle between him and whatever he imagines is waiting once I am gone. Michael was once a cheerful boy, obsessed with baseball and eager to please, and I can still remember the night he hit his first home run in Little League, running around the bases with such joy that Margaret cried in the bleachers, but adulthood seemed to carve a harder edge into him. His marriage collapsed within a decade, and ever since then he has carried a bitterness that he disguises poorly under forced jokes and impatient sighs. He visits me every week, which the staff notes with approval, but his visits are brisk and managerial, as if he is conducting an inspection. He checks the medication list, asks perfunctory questions about my sleep, then inevitably steers the conversation toward finances, reminding me of the power of attorney I granted him years ago when Margaret was first ill, a document that was meant as a safeguard in case both of us became incapacitated. For a long time I allowed that arrangement to stand, telling myself that it was natural to let the younger generation handle bureaucratic matters, yet as the months passed, I grew uneasy with the way Michael spoke of it, as if the authority were already his to wield, not something contingent on necessity. I began to notice his impatience when I contradicted him, the way he brushed aside my opinions about my own care, and I felt increasingly like a tenant in a house I had built. 6 months ago, after a night of tossing and turning, I resolved to revoke that document, to take back at least on paper the dignity of being master of my own decisions. With the help of a lawyer recommended by a veterans association, I executed the revocation and designated an old friend, Daniel Whitmore, as the alternate proxy, knowing that Daniel was the kind of man who would never make choices for me without asking. That act of revocation, though simple in its legal form, was for me a symbolic reclamation of self, a declaration that even in old age I remained the author of my story. Yet I did not announce it to Michael, fearing his reaction, and perhaps also fearing that he would interpret it as a declaration of war. I simply filed the papers, sent the appropriate copies to the county clerk, and placed the signed original in the drawer of my bedside table, here in the home. Since then, life has gone on with its quiet monotony, days blurring into weeks, punctuated only by the occasional church service or the rare letter from my granddaughter, whom I have not seen in years. I spend my afternoons reading newspapers that are delivered 2 days late, circling words and crosswords with shaky handwriting, and staring at the photographs of Margaret that I keep on the shelf above my bed, whispering to her sometimes when no one can hear. The staff here is kind enough, though kindness is rationed according to workload, and I have learned not to take offense when a nurse forgets my name and calls me sweetheart instead. The hallways smell of antiseptic and sometimes of despair, because not everyone here has visitors, and I often wonder what it means that the people who once filled our homes with laughter are now too busy or unwilling to sit beside us as the clock winds down. I do not indulge in self-pity, or at least I try not to, but I am honest enough to admit that there are nights when I ache for a familiar voice that is not professional or distracted, a voice that cares not because it is paid to care, but because it loves me. Those are the nights when I feel Margaret's absence like a hollow in my chest. In spite of everything, I have not surrendered to despair entirely. There are small pleasures, like the old man across the hall who tells the same jokes about Eisenhower but laughs so hard at them that one cannot help but laugh too, or the way the maple tree outside my window turns a brilliant scarlet in October, reminding me of the autumn drives Margaret and I once took through Vermont. I still believe that life, even in its narrowed form, retains worth, and I cling to that belief because the alternative would be unbearable. What unsettles me most is not the prospect of death itself. I have made my peace with mortality, but the possibility that someone else, even my own son, might presume to decide the timing and manner of it for me. This thought has grown heavier in recent weeks as I sense in Michael a restlessness, a certain eagerness to accelerate what he calls inevitable. I overheard him once in the hallway telling a nurse that prolonging care was not practical, and although I pretended not to hear, the words pierced me like ice. It is a peculiar pain to realize that the child you once carried on your shoulders now calculates the cost of your remaining days. Perhaps I am misjudging him. Perhaps worry disguises itself as coldness. But something in his tone has convinced me that the bond between us is frayed beyond easy repair. So I sit here in my room, penning these thoughts in the margins of a notebook I keep hidden under the mattress, because I want a record of what I felt before events take a turn I can sense approaching. I do not know precisely what form that turn will take, but the air is charged with it, like the silence before a thunderstorm. And as I write, I remind myself of one simple truth. I am still Harvey Danvers, a man who worked, loved, and endured, and until my last breath I will insist on being treated not as a burden to be managed, but as a person with dignity. The turning point arrived on a gray afternoon in late November, when the air outside was heavy with drizzle and the corridors of the nursing home smelled faintly of wet wool from visitors shaking off their coats, and I was dozing in my chair by the window, half aware of the muted chatter from the television set that the aides always left running. I had drifted into that strange half-sleep where one is not quite awake but not truly resting either, when the door of my room opened without a knock and I heard Michael's voice speaking in that firm, business-like tone he uses when he wants to remind everyone that he is the responsible party. He was not alone. I recognized the calm cadence of Dr. Ellis, the physician assigned to my case, a man of about 60 with thinning hair and a habit of pausing before each sentence as if he were carefully weighing the value of words. I kept my eyes closed, not out of pretense, but because I wanted to hear them without the distraction of having to meet anyone's gaze, and what I heard chilled me in a way that no Ohio winter draft ever could. Michael said, with a conviction that made my breath catch. I am the proxy, and I'm instructing you to end his care. He has lived long enough, and this isn't quality of life. His words were not shouted. They were delivered in that quiet, almost reasonable voice that he often adopts when he wants to cloak cruelty in the costume of practicality. But to me it sounded like a verdict being read aloud in a courtroom where I had never been allowed to testify. For a moment I wondered if I had misheard, if perhaps he was discussing some other matter. But the sharp stillness that followed convinced me otherwise, and I opened my eyes a fraction to catch sight of the two men standing near the foot of my bed. Dr. Ellis did not respond immediately. He shifted on his feet, looked down at the clipboard in his hand, then raised his eyes with a slowness that suggested discomfort. "Michael," he said, choosing his words with care, "these are serious instructions, and before I proceed with anything of that magnitude, I will need to review the current documentation. Do you have the original durable power of attorney papers on file, and are they still valid?" My son, without hesitation, reached into the leather briefcase he carries everywhere, the same one he once used when he sold insurance, and produced a folded packet of documents which he placed on the small table by the bed. "It's all here," he said. "I am his designated decision-maker. You'll see my signature and his from years ago. Nothing has changed. I have authority to decide what's best." My heart began to pound, not with the weakness of age, but with the anger of a man realizing he is being maneuvered out of his own life. I knew something that Michael either did not know or pretended not to know. 6 months earlier I had formally revoked that document and executed a new designation that stripped him of the role he now claimed so casually. The memory of signing those revocation papers returned with vivid clarity. The lawyer's calm assurance, the notary's stamp, the sense of relief that I had regained at least some control over the course of my final years. The original revocation and the new designation were stored carefully, one copy filed with the county clerk, another mailed to the nursing home's administrative office, and one more folded in my bedside drawer under my stack of crossword puzzles. At that instant, lying in my chair with my eyes half open, I wondered whether those papers had ever been properly entered into the medical file, whether bureaucratic delay or simple negligence had left the old document active in the eyes of staff. A sudden wave of dread washed over me, for if those revocation papers were absent from the chart, then Michael's claim might appear legitimate, and my fate could be steered by the cold efficiency of his ambitions. I wanted to sit up, to speak out, but my body felt momentarily heavy, as though shock had pressed down upon my chest, so I listened instead, every muscle taut with the effort to remain still and attentive. "Doctor." Ellis unfolded the document and adjusted his glasses, scanning the signature lines, his brow furrowing as he traced the dates. "This appears to be in order," he said cautiously, "but I will need to verify that no subsequent modifications have been filed. Our records must reflect the most current directives." I cannot act until I confirm Michael's reply came swift, edged with irritation. "Doctor, I assure you nothing has been changed. My father would never revoke this. He doesn't even remember half the things he signs these days. You know how forgetful he is. It's cruel to keep him lingering like this when he has no real life left." At those words my fury surged because he was not merely misrepresenting the legal status of the document. He was insulting my mind, attempting to paint me as senile and confused, stripping me of credibility before the very physician whose decisions could shape the remainder of my existence. I forced myself to draw a steady breath, and I turned my head slightly so that my eyes opened fully and fixed upon the two men. "That is a lie," I said, my voice rough but steady. The room fell silent. "Doctor..." Ellis looked startled, and Michael's face tightened into the practiced smile of a man caught in deceit, but unwilling to admit it. "I revoked that document months ago," I continued, struggling to rise a little in the chair so that my words carried weight. "I appointed Daniel Whitmore as my proxy, not you, Michael. I have the papers in my drawer, and copies are on file with the clerk. You have no right to speak for me." "None." My son's smile evaporated. replaced by a hard glare that reminded me of the look he used to give when he lost a game as a boy and blamed the umpire. "Dad," he said, his tone artificially calm, "you're confused again. You think you did that, but you didn't. You must have imagined it. I have the only valid papers, and I'm not going to let you suffer needlessly." Dr. Ellis raised his hand as if to quiet the rising tension. "Gentlemen," he said firmly, "I will not make any decision until this matter is clarified. Mr. Danvers," he looked directly at me, his voice taking on a note of respect, "if you say you revoke this document, then I must verify that before proceeding. I will request the facility administrator to produce all current legal designations. Until that is resolved, no changes to your care will be made." Those words, simple though they were, felt like a lifeline thrown into a storm. For the first time in months, I sensed that someone in authority was listening to me rather than to the narrative my son was attempting to impose. Michael, however, reacted with barely contained rage, snapping his briefcase shut and muttering something about unnecessary delays and how sentimentality was interfering with medical responsibility. He cast me one last look, a mixture of contempt and frustration, before leaving the room in quick strides that echoed down the corridor. Dr. Ellis remained behind for a moment, lowering his voice so that only I could hear. "Mr. Danvers," he said, "I appreciate your clarity. Rest assured, we will sort this out properly. Do you have a copy of the revocation here?" I nodded toward the drawer, and he retrieved the folded paper with careful hands, examining the notary seal and date. His expression shifted from doubt to recognition. "This appears valid," he murmured. "I will have it entered into your chart immediately. Thank you for keeping this." When he left the room, promising to contact the administration, I leaned back in my chair, my heart still racing but steadier, now that truth had found at least one ally. The drizzle outside continued to patter against the window, indifferent to human struggles, but for me, the world had changed in that hour. The veil of suspicion that had long hovered between Michael and me was torn aside, revealing his intentions in stark light. What had once been vague unease was now confirmed betrayal. The catalyst had come not in some dramatic explosion, but in the quiet, calculated words of a son, declaring that his father's life had reached its expiration date. And as I sat there, breathing slowly, I realized that everything from this moment forward would be a battle not only for my dignity, but for my very right to exist on my own terms. In the days that followed that confrontation, the atmosphere around me shifted in ways both subtle and unmistakable, and I began to sense the tightening of invisible threads, as if my son, unwilling to accept the doctor's cautious defiance, had decided to weave a different net to trap me, one made not of direct authority, but of small manipulations that would gradually undermine my confidence and paint me as unfit to decide for myself. It began with changes in his visits, which grew longer and more intrusive, where once he had breezed in for half an hour, skimming through my charts with the impatience of a man checking stock prices, he now lingered for hours, hovering in my room, speaking to staff in low tones just outside my door, asking pointed questions about whether I had been eating enough, whether I had ever refused medication, whether I had been confused about the date or forgotten names. And though he cloaked these inquiries in the language of concern, I could hear in every syllable the suggestion that I was faltering, that I was drifting into incompetence. At first the nurses dismissed his questions with polite shrugs, assuring him that I was as lucid as any man my age could be, but repetition has a way of seeding doubt, and soon I noticed certain looks passing between them, subtle glances that seemed to ask whether perhaps Michael was right, whether perhaps old Harvey was beginning to slip. One evening after supper I overheard two aides whispering in the hallway, one remarking that the son says he gets confused sometimes, and though the other replied that I seemed fine to her, the damage was done, for I could feel the weight of rumor settling over me like a shroud. Michael himself grew bolder in his insinuations, testing me with little traps disguised as casual conversation. He would ask, "Do you remember what day it is, Dad? Or do you recall what we talked about last week?" And When I answered correctly, he would smile thinly and say, "Good, good, you're keeping sharp." But when I hesitated, even for a second, his eyes would gleam with quiet triumph, as though he had scored a point in a game I had never agreed to play. Once again, when I mentioned an old neighbor who had died years ago, he immediately seized on it, saying loudly enough for the nurse across the room to hear, "See, you're mixing up the past again, Dad." That's what I was telling you about. The humiliation of these moments cut deep, not because I feared memory lapses. They come to all men my age, but because I knew he was twisting ordinary human forgetfulness into evidence of incapacity. I began to question my own mind, replaying conversations in bed at night, wondering whether I had truly said what he claimed or whether he had fabricated it entirely. There is a special cruelty in being gaslit by one's own child, in realizing that the boy you once carried on your shoulders has grown into a man who treats your words not as truth, but as ammunition. The tension escalated further when I discovered that Michael had been speaking not only with staff, but with the administrator of the facility, pressing for special oversight of my case, citing his supposed role as proxy and warning of my increasingly erratic behavior. I learned this by accident when Mrs. Carlson, the head nurse, came into my room with a clipboard and began asking me a series of oddly pointed questions. Did I ever forget to eat? Had I misplaced belongings? Had I been feeling disoriented during the night? And when I finally asked why, she was quizzing me like a child at school. She blushed and admitted that my son had expressed concerns and that the administration wanted to ensure my safety. Safety? How many indignities are committed in that name? Even more troubling was the subtle withdrawal of certain liberties I had previously enjoyed. I had always been allowed to keep a modest amount of cash in my drawer for small indulgences like buying a newspaper from the vending machine in the lobby or slipping a tip to the aide who trimmed my nails. But one afternoon I found the envelope missing. When I confronted the staff, they told me that Michael had requested the removal of cash from my room to prevent potential loss or theft, and that henceforth any purchases would be managed through his oversight. The realization that I could not even control a few dollars of my own money struck me with a humiliation sharper than I expected, for it symbolized the creeping erosion of autonomy that he was engineering piece by piece. The final straw of that week came when Michael, in front of Dr. Ellis and a nurse, announced that he intended to restrict my phone privileges. "Dad gets agitated after long calls," he declared, "and sometimes he forgets what was said and calls back multiple times. It's disruptive for him and for the staff." I felt my face flush with anger, for this was an outright fabrication. I had never made repeated calls, nor had I been agitated by conversations, unless agitation meant the frustration of trying to speak freely without being monitored. I spoke up then, insisting that he was lying, but Michael only sighed and looked at the doctor with a mixture of pity and resignation, as if to say, "You see? He doesn't even realize." That was the moment I realized he was not merely testing boundaries, but actively constructing a narrative of decline, brick by brick, in the hope that one day soon the wall would be complete and I would be sealed inside, voiceless and powerless. At night, lying in the dim light of the corridor lamp, I thought of Margaret and what she would say if she could see her only son maneuvering his father toward oblivion with such cold calculation. She had always defended him, even in his adult failings, saying that he was practical and realistic. But I now saw those words as veils for ambition and selfishness. I imagined her dismay, her hand clutching mine, urging me to resist, to assert the dignity we both had fought to maintain in a world that so easily forgets the elderly. And so I resolved, quietly but firmly, that I would not allow Michael to succeed in this campaign of erosion, that I would find a way to expose his motives and reclaim the ground he was trying to steal from beneath my feet. The days that followed tested that resolve, for the more I resisted, the more determined he became, and the more the staff began to look at me not with warmth, but with professional caution, as though they were unsure whether to believe the father or the son. I knew then that this was only the beginning, that the battle for my own narrative had truly begun, and that the son I once believed would protect me had instead become the architect of my undoing. The crisis that turned suspicion into certainty came one evening in early December, when the days were already shrinking into long shadows by 4 o'clock, and the staff had decorated the hallways with strings of cheap tinsel and paper snowflakes. Taped to the windows, small attempts at cheer that only deepened my sense of distance from the world I once knew. Dr. Ellis came into my room after supper, not with his usual brisk efficiency, but with the quiet deliberation of a man who carries a burden he knows cannot be delayed, and he closed the door behind him, something he rarely did, before sitting down in the chair by my bed. His face carried that serious neutrality I had seen in doctors before they delivered bad news, but the words he spoke were not about my blood pressure or my lungs. They were about my son. "Mr. Danvers," he began, lowering his voice as if even the walls might betray us, "I need to ask you something very directly, because what I have seen in the records does not match what your son has been insisting. Did you in fact revoke the power of attorney that designated him as your proxy, and did you appoint someone else in his place?" I felt the weight of the moment and answered with as much clarity as I could summon. "Yes, I revoked it. I appointed Daniel Whitmore, a lifelong friend, a man I trust. The papers are notarized and filed. My son has no authority over me, not any more." Dr. Ellis exhaled slowly, as though he had half expected, but still dreaded, that answer. "I thought as much, he said, because today, in a meeting with the administration, your son produced copies of the old documents and insisted that they remain binding, claiming you never had the capacity to revoke them. He argued that your memory lapses, which he described at length, meant that any revocation was invalid from the start. He is pressing hard for us to recognize him as the sole authority over your medical care. I need you to understand the seriousness of this. If the administration accepts his claim, decisions could be made that you do not consent to." The words struck me like a hammer, confirming that Michael was not merely maneuvering with whispers and insinuations, but had launched a direct assault on my autonomy, challenging not only my dignity but the legal foundation of my choices. I felt a heat rise in my chest, anger mingled with a kind of grief so sharp it was almost physical, for I realized then that my son no longer saw me as his father, but as an obstacle to be removed through whatever means necessary. "Doctor," I said, my voice trembling but firm, "I may be old, I may forget the odd date or name, but I am not incompetent, and I will not have my son bury me alive under paperwork. The revocation is valid, and I need you to help me prove it." "Doctor," Ellis nodded, his eyes narrowing with determination, "I believe you, and I have seen the notarized copy you keep in your drawer. That document carries weight, but we will need to verify it formally with the county records. I will request confirmation from the clerk's office tomorrow. In the meantime, I want you to know that I will not authorize any change to your care until this is resolved." "You have my word." The relief that swept over me was tempered by the knowledge that this was now a war fought not in open confrontation, but in files, signatures, and the shadows of bureaucracy, where truth and lies often blur. After he left, I sat alone in the dim light, staring at Margaret's photograph, and I spoke aloud to her as I sometimes did in moments of fear. "They want to erase me, Maggie," I whispered. "Our own son wants to write me out of my life before it is over. But I won't let him, not while I still have breath." The silence of the room seemed to answer with its own solemnity, as if she were urging me onward. The next day, Michael stormed into my room, his composure cracking in a way I had rarely seen. His voice raised, his face flushed with the effort of suppressed fury. "What did you tell the doctor?" he demanded. "Why are you lying to him, confusing him with your nonsense about revoking documents? You don't even know what you signed. You're making this harder on yourself." I looked at him calmly, though my hands trembled in my lap. "I revoked it, Michael. You know I did. You are not my proxy. You have no right to decide for me." His eyes narrowed, and In that moment I saw not the boy who once cried when his mother scolded him, but a man hardened by resentment, a man who saw me only as a key to a lock he wanted opened. He leaned close, his voice low but venomous. "Do you think anyone will believe you over me? You can't even keep track of your pills without someone reminding you. I'll tell them you're confused. I'll tell them you don't know what you're saying. By the time this is over, they'll see it my way, and you'll thank me for ending all this sooner." Then he straightened, forcing a smile when he saw a nurse pass by the door, and with a falsely cheerful, "Take care, Dad," he left me trembling in my chair. That night I lay awake for hours, the words replaying in my head, and I understood with brutal clarity that the battle had reached a new level. This was no longer about occasional slights or restricted privileges. It was about survival itself, about whether my voice would be erased under the pretense of love and practicality. The stakes had risen, and I knew the days ahead would bring confrontations more open and dangerous than anything before. The midpoint of this grim journey had arrived, not in a blaze of revelation, but in the cold realization that my son was willing to stand before strangers and declare me incapable of knowing my own mind. And yet, amid the fear, a strange strength rose within me, the stubborn steel of a man who had worked too long and endured too much to be dismissed so easily. If Michael wanted a war of documents and declarations, then I would meet him there, with truth as my only weapon and dignity as my shield. What followed after the confrontation with Dr. Ellis and Michael was not calm resolution, but a tightening storm, a deliberate escalation of hostilities that revealed the full extent of my son's motives and forced me to see, with unbearable clarity, how far he was willing to go to silence me and reshape my life into something that fit his designs. I had thought the battle might remain confined to tense conversations and whispered insinuations, but soon it spilled out into direct attacks, lies recorded in files, manipulations delivered in polite voices, and the kind of cold betrayals that only a child can commit against a parent because only a child has lived close enough to know exactly where the heart is most vulnerable. The first blow came when Dr. Ellis returned 3 days later with an expression of grim sympathy and a folder of papers he had retrieved from the administration office. "Mr. Danvers," he said, "we confirmed with the county clerk that your revocation is legally filed and in effect. That should have been the end of the matter. But your son has submitted additional documentation, medical reports bearing your name, dated within the last year, claiming you have early-stage dementia and are no longer capable of managing your own affairs. These reports are troubling not because I believe them, but because they carry signatures that appear official. I want to ask you plainly, did you ever undergo neurological evaluation for dementia?" My chest tightened as though the air itself were conspiring to choke me. "No," I said firmly. "No one has ever tested me for that. Those reports are false. They must be forgeries." He nodded, jaw tight, and lowered his voice. "That is what I suspected. The signatures belong to a physician I happen to know, and the dates do not match his practice schedule. I will alert the administrator, but understand this. Your son is trying to build a case that you are incompetent. If that argument gains traction, he could override your revocation by claiming you lacked the mental capacity to execute it in the first place. You need to be prepared because this is no longer about documents alone. This is about perception, about the story he tells versus the story you tell. And often institutions choose the narrative that seems most convenient." The words stung like acid, not because they surprised me, but because they confirmed my darkest suspicion. That Michael's goal was not simply to ease me into death under the pretense of mercy, but to gain legal control over my life, my finances, and whatever scraps of inheritance might remain after my body had been reduced to silence. I spent the night staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation we had ever had about money, every time he had sighed when I hesitated to write a check, every time he had spoken about the burden of elder care. And I realized that in his eyes I had long ago ceased to be a father and had become an account to be closed, an asset to be liquidated. The second blow landed in an even crueler way. A week later, as I sat by the window watching the snow fall on the courtyard, I heard voices in the hallway, Michael's low baritone and another man's sharper tone, speaking just loudly enough that fragments drifted into my room. I realized after a moment that Michael was not speaking to staff, but into his phone, unaware that his words carried through the thin walls. "Yes," he said, "the policy pays within 30 days of death. He's been declining, and honestly, there's no point in dragging it out. Once I'm confirmed as the proxy again, I'll authorize comfort care only. It'll be quick, and then we can settle everything." The payout should cover the mortgage and then some. I froze in my chair, every muscle locked, my breath shallow, my heart hammering so hard I feared it might give out then and there. He was talking about life insurance, about the financial harvest of my death, as casually as if he were discussing the sale of a used car. My son, the boy I had once stayed up with when he was feverish, rocking him through the night, was now planning the timetable of my departure like a businessman managing accounts receivable. I clenched the arms of my chair until my knuckles hurt, willing myself not to cry out, because I wanted to hear more, wanted to know just how deep the rot went. But he soon lowered his voice, stepped further away, and the rest was lost to distance. The knowledge, though, was enough to harden me. Whatever illusions I had clung to about misunderstanding or overreaction crumbled that day, and I knew with the certainty of iron that Michael's love had been replaced by calculation, that his care for me was a performance designed to cover the machinery of his plan. He would not hesitate to end my life if it served his financial needs, and he would dress it in the language of mercy, convincing others he was acting out of compassion, while in truth he was counting dollars. That realization was like a cold blade against my spine, and it lit a fire inside me that burned through my fear. The third blow arrived in the form of humiliation, deliberate and public. One evening, during dinner in the common hall, Michael appeared unexpectedly, sat beside me, and began speaking loudly to the nurse across the room. "You'll need to keep an eye on him," he said, pointing his thumb at me as though I were an unruly child. "He's been forgetting his meds again, and yesterday he tried to wander out without shoes. I'm worried he's not safe anymore." The nurse looked startled, glancing between us, and I immediately protested. "That never happened," I said, my voice rising. "I never left without shoes. I take my medication every day." He's lying, but Michael only patted my arm in mock reassurance, smiling at the nurse as though indulging the tantrum of a confused elder. "It's okay, Dad. No need to get upset. We'll make sure you're comfortable." Laughter rose from another table, not cruel, but pitying, and I felt the sting of it deep in my bones. That night I could not sleep, replaying the scene, the way the nurse had looked at me with doubt, the way the other residents had whispered. It was not simply the insult of being lied about, but the erosion of my credibility in the eyes of others. Michael was crafting a persona for me, one of confusion and instability, and once that persona took root in the minds of staff and residents alike, my protests would be dismissed as the ravings of a man who did not know his own mind. The battle was no longer about documents in drawers, but about identity itself, about who I was allowed to be in the eyes of the world. As the weeks passed, his tactics grew sharper. I discovered one morning that my checkbook had been removed from my drawer. When I asked staff, they told me Michael had requested it be kept in the office for safekeeping, citing my supposed forgetfulness. I demanded its return, but the administrator politely declined, citing his concerns. I realized then that piece by piece, my tools of independence were being stripped away, leaving me increasingly dependent on the very son who sought to erase me. Yet amid the despair, allies emerged. One night, as I sat in the lounge pretending to read, a young nurse named Clarissa slipped into the chair beside me and spoke in a whisper. "Mr. Danvers," she said, "I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I heard your son talking to Doctor Ellis last week saying you were a danger to yourself and should be declared incompetent. The doctor didn't agree, but he's under pressure. I just want you to know. Some of us believe you. We can see you're sharp." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not only because of the kindness, but because they reminded me that truth can survive even in whispers. Later, Doctor. Ellis himself confirmed my fears. He came into my room with a weary look and said, "Michael has filed a petition with the county court to review your competency. He's arguing that you were not of sound mind when you revoked his power of attorney. We will need to schedule an independent evaluation to counter this. I'm on your side, but you must be ready. This will not be easy." The gravity of his tone told me everything. I was not simply fighting a son's ambition, but an entire system that often prefers convenience to justice. I nodded, gripping his hand with a strength I did not know I still possessed. "Let them test me," I said. "Let them look into my mind. I will not let him steal my voice. I've lived too long, worked too hard, to be buried alive by lies." That night, for the first time in years, I prayed not for peace or rest, but for strength to endure, to outlast the storm my son had unleashed. And in the silence of the darkened room, I felt Margaret's presence as though she were sitting beside me, whispering courage into my ear. The war had escalated beyond anything I could have imagined, but I knew now with absolute certainty that I would not go quietly. If my son wanted to strip me of dignity, he would have to fight for every inch, and in that fight he would discover that even an old man has teeth. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than I expected, though by then I had grown accustomed to waking each morning with a sense of waiting, as if the air itself held its breath before some final confrontation. It was a gray morning in January, the kind of day when the sun never really rises, but only struggles behind a veil of cloud, and I was summoned to the administrator's office, where Dr. Ellis sat alongside two other officials I had not met before, a social worker with a clipboard and a representative from the county's legal office. Michael was already there, standing stiffly in his pressed suit, holding his briefcase like a weapon, his expression the familiar mask of forced concern that hid the steel beneath. I was seated across from them at a long wooden table, and for a moment the room felt like a courtroom, though no judge sat at the head. The administrator cleared his throat and explained in a solemn voice that there had been disputes regarding my competency and the validity of my revocation of power of attorney. He said the purpose of the meeting was to clarify matters and to ensure that my rights, as well as my well-being, were properly protected. I nodded, though inside me a storm raged, because I knew this was the moment Michael had been orchestrating. The arena where he expected to triumph by painting me as a confused old man incapable of knowing his own mind. Michael spoke first, his tone calm but edged with triumph. He laid out his claim that I had been increasingly forgetful, that I had moments of disorientation, that I had once mistaken the year or misplaced belongings, and that under such conditions my revocation of his authority could not possibly be considered valid. He presented the forged medical reports, sliding them across the table with a flourish, and for a moment I saw in the eyes of the social worker a flicker of belief, the dangerous possibility that his narrative might succeed. He spoke of compassion, of not wanting to see me linger in indignity, of wishing only to spare me suffering, and as he spoke I recognized the cruel brilliance of his tactic. He clothed greed in the language of love, and to an outsider it might sound convincing. But then Dr. Ellis, who had sat quietly until that moment, cleared his throat and asked permission to speak. His voice carried none of Michael's polish, but instead the steady weight of a man accustomed to truth. "I have examined Mr. Danvers personally many times," he said, "and I can attest that he is of sound mind. He recalls details, dates, and events with clarity. He understands the nature of the documents he signed and revoked. Furthermore, I have examined the so-called medical reports presented here and have reason to believe they are fraudulent. The signatures do not match those of the physician named, and the dates do not correspond to his practice. These documents should be considered invalid." He placed the folder aside firmly, and in that moment the balance of the room shifted. Michael's face flushed, his mask cracking for a second as he snapped, "You're mistaken, Doctor. You don't see how he really is when he's alone. He gets confused all the time. You're being manipulated by him." But his words rang hollow, brittle, and I saw the social worker glance from him to me with new doubt. I seized that moment, forcing my trembling hands to steady as I leaned forward. "I am not confused," I said clearly, letting my voice rise from the depths of my chest. "I know exactly what I did. I revoked Michael's power of attorney because I no longer trust him to act in my best interest. I appointed my friend Daniel Whitmore instead, a man who has stood beside me for 50 years, who would never speak of me as though I were already dead. Michael has lied about me, forged documents, and sought to strip me of my dignity for his own gain. I will not be erased. This is my life, and I alone have the right to decide how it ends." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the scratching of the social worker's pen. Michael sputtered, tried to regain his composure, muttered about my supposed confusion, but the tide had turned. The legal representative asked calmly whether I had evidence of the revocation, and I produced the notarized copy doctor. Ellis had safeguarded. The seal clear, the date precise. The representative studied it, nodded once, and placed it carefully on the table. "This document is valid," he declared. "The revocation stands." Michael exploded then, his composure shattering, his voice rising with fury. "You can't do this. He doesn't know what he's doing. He's throwing away his life, and when he's gone, when the money is wasted, don't come crying to me." His face twisted, and for a moment I saw not the man but the bitter, frightened child within, grasping for control he could not hold. The administrator called for calm. Staff entered to escort him out, but his words lingered in the air, venomous and desperate. When the room finally settled, "Doctor," Ellis turned to me with a faint smile of reassurance. "You are safe, Mr. Danvers," he said softly. "Your voice has been heard." I felt a weight lift from my chest, not entirely gone, but lightened, as if for the first time in months the ground beneath me was steady again. The climax had not come with violence, but with truth laid bare, with lies exposed under the steady gaze of authority. Yet the victory was not sweet. It was bitter, tinged with the knowledge that my own flesh and blood had stood across from me, fighting not for my life, but for my end. As I was wheeled back to my room, the snow still falling outside, I whispered to Margaret's photograph on the nightstand, "We won today, Maggie." He can't silence me, not yet. And though exhaustion pressed heavy on my bones, there was also a flicker of pride, a sense that I had stood my ground in the face of betrayal, that I had reclaimed, at least for now, the right to be the author of my own final chapter. In the weeks that followed the confrontation, a quieter rhythm returned to my days, though nothing could erase the memory of my son's fury as he was escorted from the room, his voice echoing down the hallway with accusations that no longer held power, but still carried the sting of betrayal. The administrators reassured me repeatedly that the revocation stood, that Michael had no legal authority left, and that any future attempts by him to interfere would be denied. Dr. Ellis stopped by more frequently, not only to check on my health, but to remind me gently that I was heard, that my words carried weight. And though he never said it outright, I could sense in his manner a kind of quiet respect, the respect of one man to another who has endured a trial and refused to bow. Yet peace is never whole when the battlefield has been your own family. I found myself lying awake at night, staring into the shadows of my room, wondering how the boy who once clutched my hand at a county fair, frightened by the noise of the fireworks, could have grown into the man who stood in front of strangers and argued for my life to be cut short. I replayed the moments of his childhood, the scraped knees I bandaged, the baseball mitts I oiled, the college tuition I scraped together with extra shifts at the plant, and each memory clashed violently with the image of him now, standing cold and hard-eyed, briefcase in hand, speaking of me as if I were a burden to be managed rather than a father to be honored. It was grief of a peculiar kind, not the grief of death, but of recognition, the death of the illusion that blood alone could bind a heart to loyalty. But alongside that, grief came a kind of clarity, a stripping away of false hopes that left me oddly freer than before. I realized that I no longer had to pretend, no longer had to excuse his behavior as mere impatience or practicality. The mask had fallen, and what lay beneath was greed and resentment, and though the knowledge hurt, it also gave me a path forward. I spoke with Daniel, my oldest friend, who came to visit one cold afternoon, his cane tapping against the linoleum as he made his slow way to my chair. We sat for hours, two old men reminiscing about army days and fishing trips, but eventually the conversation turned serious. "Harvey," he said, his voice rough with age but steady, "you've carried this boy too long. It's time to put your affairs in order in a way that honors who you are, not who he has become." The next week, with Daniel's help and the quiet guidance of an attorney from the Veterans Association, I rewrote my will. I left nothing to Michael, not out of vengeance, but out of recognition that to give him anything would be to reward betrayal. Instead, I directed what little remained, my modest savings, my insurance, and the small pension I had earned through decades of work, to a foundation that supports elderly veterans and widows. It was not a fortune, but it was mine, and I wanted it to go where it could ease burdens rather than deepen the greed of a man already poisoned by it. When I signed the papers, my hand shook not with weakness but with a strange exhilaration, the sensation of taking back at last the power to decide. Life in the home continued its slow rhythm, meals at the same times, the same television humming in the background, the same aides shuffling by with trays and pill cups. But for me, something essential had shifted. I no longer felt like a man waiting helplessly for others to decide his fate. I felt instead like a man who had walked through fire and emerged singed but still standing. The betrayal of my son would never heal, I knew that, but I also knew that I had not surrendered, that I had faced him down with truth, and that in the ledger of my life I would not be remembered, at least not by myself, as a man who allowed his dignity to be stolen. Sometimes, in the quiet of evening, I still hear his words, the cold calculation of insurance payouts, the insistence that I was confused, the final outburst as he was led away, and each time it stings anew. But then I turn my eyes to the maple tree outside my window, bare now, but soon to bloom again, and I remind myself that survival is its own kind of victory. Margaret's picture still rests on my table, and I speak to her as if she were near, telling her that we have outlasted the storm, that love and dignity endured even when family failed. In the end, justice did not come in the form of punishment for Michael. He still walks free, still bitter, still searching for some profit in a world that no longer bends to him. But justice did come in the form of freedom, the freedom to choose, the freedom to live whatever time remains on my own terms. And as I sit here now, writing these words in the last pages of my notebook, I feel something close to peace. The story is not one I ever wish to tell, but it is mine, and it ends not with silence imposed by another's will, but with my voice, steady and unbroken, declaring that even in old age, even in betrayal, a man can hold fast to his dignity and claim his own ending